How's it guys, it's MJ, and in this video I'm going to be talking about credit risk. Remember, this is mainly just my opinion, so don't take anything stated as fact, rather quote your textbook in the exams. This is very much an alternative view. But without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start talking about credit risk. And once again, we're starting with a definition issue. Some people refer to counterparty risk as a form of credit risk. Other people only refer to default risk as credit risk. So we do have this split in definitions. Counterparty risk is whenever you rely on another party and they fail to meet your obligations. So whether it's a supplier who fails to bring the goods, or someone who says they're going to do something but they don't, that is known as counterparty risk. I had a little encounter with counterparty risk myself. I signed up for this Google thing where you have to review 200 places and then they give you a terabyte of hard drive space. I did that only for them to then say, sorry, we're not going to give you that free terabyte. We're only going to give you 100 gigabytes. That's an example of a counterparty risk where you're relying on someone and they let you down. Google, however, very clever, they have their little terms and conditions, so I cannot sue them or be too disgruntled. You know that super long list of documents? Yeah, that's why you should read that. Anyway, getting back to the video, credit risk, there's the other one which talks about default. Default is what I'm mainly going to be talking about in this video. This is when you give somebody money as a loan and they fail to repay it. So they default on that obligation. And we're going to be looking at that as our main form of credit risk. So credit risk in this regard has got two dimensions that I want to talk about. So I'm not talking about counterparty risk, we're talking about default. And the two dimensions or the two components is the probability of the default happening and the amount of the loss because of the default. So amount of loss. What's nice about these two components is that you can multiply them together and you can get some sort of expected loss. And that's quite cool because you can use this to compare to two loans. One loan has got a high probability but just a small loss. Another one's got a low probability but a big loss. You can combine them together in order to compare. One thing I do find quite interesting when it comes to, say, credit risk is what we sometimes do is if someone has a high probability of defaulting, this we see specifically in unsecured lending, what they tend to do is they tend to charge these people a higher interest. So if there's a high probability that you're going to default, the financial intermediary will charge you a higher interest. The interesting thing, though, about charging a higher interest is the higher interest you charge, the more you're going to increase the probability of default. Think about it. If you only have to pay 10% back, that's much easier to repay than, say, 20%, and therefore there will be that higher probability. So maybe by charging higher interest rates, you are causing more people to default, which therefore causes you to charge even higher interest rates, which causes even more defaults. And we saw something like this happen in South Africa recently. When I mean recently, like the past 2 years, with a company, African Bank. They were lending money to people, unsecured lending, and charging a very high interest rate, thinking that that would combat the high credit risk, but it caused people to default even more, and yeah, they got wiped out. Bye-bye. So credit risk is quite a serious risk. It can bring down financial intermediaries. It did play a big role in the financial crisis. We called it the credit crunch because one of the things is people thought, okay, we're in a recession, things are going crazy, let's try and reduce our risks. An easy risk to reduce is credit risk by just stop lending, but by stop lending money, you create a liquidity trap so people couldn't do business, and hence the recession that came from the credit crisis. Okay, anyway, let's get back to these two components. Amount of loss, that's very easy to calculate. I mean, if you lend someone 100 Rand, you know that the amount of loss will be 100 Rand. If you lend them 100 Rand and if they don't repay, you've got, say, collateral on their 50 Rand cell phone, then, 50 Rand is the amount of loss. Although we'll talk more about recoveries a little bit later. But this is the one that I do have a bit of a problem with. How on earth do you calculate the probability, or how do you say someone has a 10% chance of defaulting? It's almost a pseudo probability that they're coming up with here. And I don't think it is possible to accurately predict or model the true probability of an individual defaulting. The best that we can do is do some sort of estimate for the category that person falls under. So we can say people who earn less than this amount or who live in this town have a higher probability than other people. Interestingly enough, because people tend to categorize people when they defining credit risk, this categorizing has had some unfortunate social consequences. One thing with categorizing is that it has led to discrimination. One particular form of discrimination happened in America, where what they did is they said, because like I said, it's impossible to calculate the probability of an individual, they created groups, and they said groups have certain credit risks. And one of their groups was, they said that African Americans had a higher credit risk and therefore need to be charged a higher interest. So you could go and you could have the exact same salary, the same degree, the same everything, but because of the color of your skin or your ethnicity, the financial banks would say, sorry, you have to charge, we're going to charge you much higher interest, or we're not going to lend you any money because of your ethnicity. And this had massive social consequences, because it means this group of people couldn't buy houses, couldn't start growing economically, and it did put them at quite a big disadvantage. So that's why this probability thing here, I mean, some sort of discrimination is good. People with low salaries might not be able to repay as people with high salaries. Maybe that's a much better measure. I know today's rules in a lot of countries say you are not allowed to discriminate based on skin color or ethnicity, despite whatever your data says, because your data might have been flawed. Specifically, say in the USA, there might have been a ghost factor or a hidden variable that the models weren't picking up. So that is a little bit of a dark side of credit risks that has happened. Look, I don't think it happens too much today, but it was happening a lot in the past. I'm not 100% certain when exactly, but I know it was sometime in like the 1900s. Okay, let's look at what else can we talk about with credit risk. One thing that they refer to as credit risk, which I think is more a liquidity risk, is late payment. So let's say you lend someone 100 Rand and they don't pay it back tomorrow, they only pay it back the following day. I see that more as a liquidity risk than as a credit risk, although because it's in the sense that the person is not making the payment on time, some textbooks do categorize that as a credit risk. Because remember, what we're going to be seeing is these risk categories aren't perfect, and there's a lot of different ways to define them, and they fit quite nicely in a bunch of different size boxes. I mean, another one which some people consider as a market risk and other people consider as a credit risk is a change in a credit spread. Okay, credit spread is when you go from a AAA rating down to, say, a AA rating. That reduction in your credit rating is referred to as a credit spread, and that can change the effect of your value of your bond. And that's why people say, oh, that's a market risk, because now your bond, which they say would have been worth 100 Rand, because now it's now got a price of, say, 90 Rand, people say that reduction in value is market. Other people would say, well, it's coming from credit. So you can see there is a little bit of debate. Different textbooks will say different things. Another type of risk that is classified sometimes as credit risk, but other people classify it as something different, is something known as contagion or systemic risk. Okay, contagion or systemic risk. And this is one of the scariest risks. This is also one of the things that cause chaos in the world recession. I know it's weird. It's almost like everything in finance went wrong, and that's because of systemic risk. So systemic risk says that if one part of the machine breaks down, the entire thing comes to a halt. So what we mean by contagion systemic risk, I'll give you a quick little example. Imagine a supply chain where you have this person is lending to this person who's lending to that person type of thing. And let's say this person over here fails to repay this person here. So this person here defaults. This then causes this person to default, which then causes me to have problems. Why this is seen as systemic risk is because when we looked at, or when we did our credit models and all this type of stuff, we were looking at this party and we thought, no, this party's fine. But we didn't take into consideration this party's credit risk or this party's other risks that are dependent on, say, other parties. It could have even been counterparty risk. And the risk that this fails and causes them to fail is known as systemic or contagion. One way to try and get around this is the use of a copula, which people did try to do. I mean, an actuary called, I think his name is David X. He was like, no, we can use these copulas to model this contagion risk. Totally stuffed up because, again, he used a normal distribution instead of one that was more skew and fat-tailed. And so the credit rating agencies were like, oh, look at this maths. They didn't really understand it. They accepted it, and they were giving things AAA rating that should not have had AAA rating because they contained all this contingent and systemic risk. But it's a very difficult one to pick up, and it sometimes is known also as like the hidden risk or an unknown risk, and people freak out about that. Okay, what else can we talk about with credit risk? There is something known as recovery or as collateral. So what will happen is, let's say you go to the bank and you say, I want to take out a bond or I need a loan of, say, 100,000 Rand. They'll say, oh, that's great, Mr. Jordan, we'll give you your 100,000 Rand. However, if you don't repay it, we're going to take away your house. We're going to repossess it. Or we're going to take your car and we're going to use it as collateral. But now the thing is, it's not that simple, okay? Let's say I default and the bank comes and takes away my house. There's a lot of legal things that they have to go through. They can't just come in and kick me out. They first have to get something from the law, and it is quite a bit of a mission. Also, they then need to try and sell this house. That's going to take a delay. I mean, houses aren't that marketable. They're not as liquid of an asset. They might have to sell it for a little bit less, maybe sell it for 70,000, which means let's say they sell for 70,000, their costs are 20,000, which means overall the recovery is only 50,000, which means they still have an amount of 100,000 at risk, and there's all these extra effort and stuff that has to go into it. So don't think, oh, I can remove my credit risk by simply slapping on a collateral. That person could also, I mean, the house could have burnt down, or they might have lied about it. I mean, there's a lot of, this gets messy. You don't want to, taking collateral is, it's what some people do is they sell that off to a debt collector. You know, those guys with big baseball bats that come in and that you see in the movies. Yeah, it's not a very pleasant business to be in. From either the receiving end or the giving end. Finally, I mean, one more thing. I'm going to make separate videos on credit risk models, just so that this video doesn't go on for too long. What color should I use? One other thing I do want to talk about is, remember when we can when we want to say manage risk, maybe I'll make a separate video on managing risk, talking about how you can diversify it and trade them and monitoring exposure. I think, yeah, let me make a separate video for managing risk. One last thing I want to talk about in this video is information. And this is almost like a little bit of an introduction for the next video. Information is very, very, very important when it comes to credit risk. If, let's say, Abigail and Bridget had to come and ask you for a loan, and you can only lend it to one of them, which one do you lend it to? If you only know their names, that's not enough information for you to make a reasonable decision. But you might find out that Abigail has got a salary of 100 Rand a day and Bridget only has 50 Rand a day. You might say, oh, well then Abigail might be better. However, there might be more information, and you find out that information is that Abigail's got expenses of 90 Rand, whereas Bridget only has expenses of 5 Rand. That means this extra additional information has changed your opinion, because now we know that Bridget has a disposable income of 45 with which to service the debt, and Abigail only has 10. But then we also find out that Bridget's job is ending at the end of the month. So this 45 here is not sustainable. And as you can see, is after each piece of information we get, it could change our opinion. However, information costs money, it costs time. It can, if I'm Abigail and I have to fill out an entire form from one bank, whereas another form's only asking me 2 questions, I'm rather going to go to the bank that is only asking me 2 questions. So when it comes to information, you have to think of the time, the effort, the marketability, and the cost that extra information gets. So you almost want to try and optimize it so that you get the maximum amount of information to improve your analysis. And it's almost like marginal utility. Each piece of information is not as valuable as the previous one. As you get more information, it becomes less and less valuable due to decreasing marginal returns. Remember that from good old economics. And one other big disadvantage of, say, this is Abigail and Bridget have perfect information about, so let's say there are 5 factors, okay? And you only have the marketing or time to look at 3 of them. So you can look at 3, you can look at 3. There are still 2 unknowns, which means there is that risk that you're choosing the wrong person. And Abigail and Bridget can know that. So if you give them an interest rate, and if they're smart and they can do their own credit models, they will look at that interest rate, compare it because they have an information advantage of you, and they can choose whether to accept it or not to accept it. Fortunately for banks and financial intermediaries, not that many people are educated enough to calculate their own credit risk and what the right interest rate should be charged to them. So I don't think banks are too phased about this on individual levels, but when it comes to corporates, it might be more of an issue, that the corporates have better information, they know whether the deal is going to be more sustainable or not, and also they might not lie, but they might bend the truth here. So Bridget might pretend that no, she'll definitely get her job renewed at the end of the month, or Abigail will be like, oh, I'll definitely cut down on my expenses, or I won't mention that I have a pedicure every single day that costs 10 Rand or something. So information is an important one. It is power, and it's one thing that we're going to see the models in the following videos are going to try and use, or they're going to try to create models to say what piece of information are the most important, so that we can get those and get a good credit rating for the people before we lend them, or that we know what type of interest rate to charge them. But I think that's let me make separate videos on modeling credit risk, and then maybe also do another video on credit risk management. It is a fascinating risk. It's one of the big ones other than market risk. So it is good to have a nice understanding about it. But anyway, thanks guys so much for watching. Remember to subscribe. A new video is coming out every single day. But remember, it is my opinion. This is me just studying out loud. So make sure to read up on this stuff on your own and think the material through before you go and write your exams. Thanks, guys. Cheers.